Some called it charisma, others called it deception. But whatever name you gave it, Ethan knew how to talk his way into and out of almost anything. From the outside, he looked like he had it all together: a quick smile, a confident swagger, and a way with words that could turn a no into a yes before you even realized it. But behind the charm was a man running out of options. At 32, Ethan had no stable job, no real income, and no intention of working a 9 to 5 like everyone else. He had tasted the thrill of fast money, of easy scams, and he wasn't about to settle for anything less. Why work hard when people were so easy to fool? At first it was small things, a little borrowed cash from a friend here, a white lie to family there. But as his needs grew, so did his lies. Jake, listen, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Ethan had told his best friend, leaning in with that conspiratorial glint in his eye. A buddy of mine is launching a startup. He's letting me in on the ground floor. I just need $5,000 to buy in. We're talking major returns. Jake, a loyal friend since high school, barely hesitated. Of course, man, I trust you. And just like that, Ethan had rent money for the next 2 months. Next came his sister, Claire. I messed up, Claire. I took a loan and I thought I could pay it back fast, but now they're threatening me. His voice cracked just enough to sound real. I wouldn't ask if I wasn't desperate. Claire, the responsible one, the one who had always bailed him out, sighed but wired him the money. Last time, Ethan, I mean it. But there was never a last time. But the cons got easier, the lies smoother, until he tricked his own mother. It started with a phone call. Mum, I got into an accident. They're saying I need a lawyer. His mother didn't even hesitate. Baby, don't worry. I'll send you whatever I can. She was already on a fixed income, struggling with medical bills of her own. She started skipping her medication just to help him. And Ethan? He never gave it a second thought. Until the day everything came crashing down. It happened in the middle of a Sunday afternoon. His phone buzzed, and when he saw Claire's name, he ignored it. Then came a text. Mum collapsed. We're at the hospital. You need to come now. Ethan froze. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about money. He wasn't thinking about his next scheme. He wasn't thinking about how to talk his way out of trouble. Because this time, there was no talking his way out of it. This time, he had gone too far, and suddenly, winning didn't feel like winning anymore. Ethan's stomach twisted as he rushed into the hospital, his sneakers squeaking against the sterile white floors. The scent of antiseptic burned his nose, but nothing could distract him from the guilt clawing at his insides. I'm looking for Margaret Collins, he told the nurse at the front desk, his voice hoarse. Her gaze flicked over him, unimpressed. Are you family? Family. The word hit differently now. He nodded. I'm her son. The nurse barely glanced at the chart before motioning toward the hallway. Room 217. Your sister's already there. His heart pounded as he approached the door. He hadn't seen Claire in weeks, not since their last fight, when she told him she was done covering for him, done cleaning up his messes. Now, he wasn't just walking into a hospital room. He was walking into the consequences of his own actions. Claire sat beside their mother's bed, arms crossed tight over her chest. She barely spared him a glance. Took you long enough? Ethan ignored the jab, his eyes landing on their mother. She looked smaller, frail. Her usually warm brown skin was pale, her lips dry and cracked. The sight knocked the breath out of him. What happened? His voice was barely above a whisper. Claire let out a bitter laugh. What happened? What happened is that she's been skipping her medication. Insulin, Ethan. She didn't have the money and I couldn't figure out why until I found out where it went. She turned, eyes blazing with fury. She gave it to you, didn't she? Ethan opened his mouth, ready with some half-baked excuse, a lie to smooth things over. But the look on Claire's face stopped him cold. There was nothing he could say. He dropped into the chair beside the bed, his hands shaking. His mother had given him everything. Raised him alone after their father walked out, worked 2 jobs to keep them fed, sacrificed so he could have a decent life. And he repaid her by stealing the very thing keeping her alive. No. For the first time in years, Ethan couldn't find the words to manipulate the situation. "She's stable now," Claire said, her voice softer but no less cutting. "But the damage is done. The doctor said if she skips another dose, we might not be so lucky next time." Ethan swallowed hard. Next time, he could brush off losing Jake. He could survive Claire hating him. But their mother, the only person who had never given up on him? That was different. Claire stood, grabbing her purse. "I hope you're happy." "Claire, wait." She held up a hand. "No, I'm done. You want to ruin your life. Fine. But you're not dragging us down with you anymore." With that, she walked out, leaving him alone with the sound of his mother's heart monitor. Ethan stayed at the hospital all night. He watched his mother sleep, her breathing uneven, her body weak from everything he had taken from her. How many times had she chosen him over herself? By morning, he had made a decision and he had to fix this. But fixing it meant doing something he had never done before, taking responsibility. The first thing he did was sell everything he owned, which wasn't much: a used car, a few electronics, some expensive sneakers he'd once bragged about. He even pawned his father's old watch, the only thing he had left of him. The money wasn't enough to pay everyone back, but it was a start. Jake was the first person he faced. They met at a diner, the same one they used to hit after high school football games. But there was no laughter, no reminiscing, just cold silence. Ethan slid an envelope across the table. "It's not everything, but it's what I have." Jake looked at the cash, then back at him. "Why now?" Ethan exhaled. "Because I finally get it." Jake's jaw tensed. "You get what exactly?" "That I ruined everything. That I used the people who love me." Jake studied him for a long moment. "You know, I spent months thinking I was an idiot for trusting you." He shook his head. "Turns out I was just an idiot for believing you'd ever change." Ethan felt the sting of those words, but he didn't fight them. He deserved them. "I don't expect you to forgive me," his voice was steady, "but I needed you to know I'm trying." Jake didn't take the money, not then, but he didn't walk away either. And for Ethan, that was a start. His mother was still recovering when he walked into her hospital room again, this time with medicine in hand. She blinked at him, tired but alert. "Ethan?" Just his name. No anger, no disappointment, just exhaustion. He placed the insulin on the table. "I took care of it." A long silence stretched between them. Then she asked the question that had been haunting him for days. "Why, baby?" He closed his eyes, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Because I was selfish and stupid, and I thought I could get away with it forever." His mother sighed, looking at him like she could see right through him. "And now?" Ethan met her eyes. "Now I just want to make things right." She didn't say anything at first, just reached out, her frail fingers brushing against his hand. "Then do it, Ethan, but not just for me. Do it for yourself." Ethan's next step was harder than anything he'd ever done. He got a job, a real one, not a scam, not a hustle, a job at a local outreach program that helped recovering addicts and
cons rebuild their lives. He hated it at first. The work was exhausting, the pay was terrible, and the temptation to fall back into old habits was overwhelming.
But for the first time, he had purpose.
One night, a young man named Luis came in, a kid, barely 20, who had just lost everything to gambling debts. Ethan listened to his story, nodding at all the familiar excuses.
And then, without thinking, he said the words no one had ever said to him. "It's not too late to change." Luis scoffed. "Yeah, and how do you know?"
Ethan exhaled.
"Because I did." The kid just stared at him, skeptical but listening. And in that moment, Ethan realized what he'd gained. He may have lost people, he may have burned bridges, but now he had the chance to help someone avoid making the same mistakes he had. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth something. Ethan hadn't expected forgiveness to come quickly, if at all, and for a while it didn't. Claire still refused to take his calls. Jake would occasionally text back, but nothing more. His mother, though physically recovering, still had a quiet sadness in her eyes whenever she looked at him. And honestly, he didn't blame them. For the first time in his life, he understood that words, no matter how smooth, weren't enough. He had spent years using them as currency, trading in lies and manipulation. Now, he had to let his actions do the talking, and actions took time. Ethan's job at the outreach program became his lifeline. At first, it was just a way to stay busy, to avoid falling back into old habits. But then he met more people like Luis, people who had spent their lives running from responsibility, chasing shortcuts, convincing themselves that one more con, one more lie, would fix everything. And Ethan saw himself in every single one of them. There was a kid who had stolen from his grandmother, a woman who had lied to her husband for years about money, a man who had burned every bridge so badly that he didn't even know if he wanted to fix things anymore. Ethan wasn't there to preach. He wasn't there to pretend he was better than them. He was just there to listen. And sometimes that was enough. Months passed before Jake finally agreed to meet him again. This time it wasn't at their old diner, it wasn't at a bar or a coffee shop. It was at a small community center where Jake had started volunteering in his spare time. Ethan showed up early, nervous in a way he hadn't been in years. He spotted Jake across the room, helping set up chairs for a local event. When their eyes met, there was no immediate warmth. No reunion hug or slap on the back, just a nod, a small acknowledgement that Ethan was still here. Jake finished setting up before finally walking over. "You're still at the outreach program?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, almost 6 months now." Jake crossed his arms. "Why?" Ethan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Because I needed to do something real, something that wasn't about me for once."
Jake studied him, his expression unreadable. "And what, you think that just erases everything?" Ethan shook his head. "No, nothing erases what I did." He met Jake's gaze, steady this time. "But I can either spend the rest of my life running from it, or I can try to make something out of what's left." Jake was silent for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the envelope of money Ethan had given him months ago. Untouched. He tossed it onto the nearby table. "You want to prove you've changed? Donate it."
Ethan blinked. "What?" "Donate it." Jake's voice was firm. "Because if this really isn't about you anymore, then you shouldn't need it back."
Ethan swallowed hard. That money was months of scraping, of selling everything he had, of working shifts that drained him to the bone. And yet, "Okay," he said quietly.
Jake raised an eyebrow. "Yeah?" Ethan nodded. Yeah. Jake hesitated. Then, for the first time in months, he smiled. A small one, but real. If earning Jake's trust back was a battle, Claire was a war. She had been burned the worst, the deepest, and unlike Jake, Claire wasn't looking for reasons to forgive him. She was looking for proof that he wasn't the same person who had nearly cost their mother her life. Ethan called her every week. No answer. He texted, left voicemails, nothing. It wasn't until Christmas Eve, nearly a year after everything fell apart, that he got an unexpected message. From Claire. Mom's house, 7 p.m. Don't be late. Ethan arrived at their mother's house 5 minutes early, clutching a bag of groceries like it was a shield. Inside, the air was thick with warmth and the smell of Claire's homemade pot roast. Their mother sat on the couch, a knitted blanket draped over her legs. She looked stronger now, healthier. The sight filled Ethan with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. Claire was setting the table, her back to him. She hadn't spoken a word yet. He hesitated. Claire, sit down, she interrupted.
Not cold, not warm, just neutral.
Ethan obeyed. Dinner was quiet, no angry words, no outbursts, just the normal hum of plates clinking, the occasional question from their mother, and Claire's clipped responses. It wasn't until their mother excused herself to go rest that Claire finally looked at him. Really looked at him. "Why are you still trying?" she asked, voice quiet but sharp. "You could have disappeared, started fresh somewhere else, so why keep chasing after people who don't trust you anymore?"
Ethan took a slow breath. "Because I don't want to be that person anymore." Claire's jaw clenched. "And how do I know you won't just turn back into him?" Ethan met her gaze, unwavering. "You don't."
Silence. Then Claire sighed, rubbing her temples. "You hurt us, Ethan." Her voice wavered just a little. "You hurt me." His throat tightened. "I know. And I don't know if I can ever fully trust you again."
He swallowed hard. "I get it." Claire studied him for a moment. Then, finally, but I think I'd like to try. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't a promise, but it was a start. And as Ethan sat there in the warmth of his mother's home with his sister across from him, and a chance, just a chance, at something real, he realized something. For the first time in his life, he wasn't lying and
He wasn't faking, he wasn't conning, and he was just Ethan.
maybe, just maybe, that was enough.